There's also a practical problem, I would say, and this goes back to kind of having a small art scene in a sense, is that art critics become very unpopular very quickly if they do criticize, you know, and it's not a criticism, it's a critique, you know, and one of the things that I was quite, you know, because I only have my personal experience to draw from, is that when I was a gallery director, sure I knew all the critics, but I never ever bought up something that they wrote unless it was factually wrong, because their opinions were expressed in that, and just because I'm having a drink with them, you know, at night, or having a cup of coffee with them, doesn't mean that I have to take what they say personally, you know? And I think that's a practical problem which exists not only here, but in New York City. I mean, even the big critics talk about this and they suffer from it, is that, you know, you don't want to be the guy who's hated at the dinner party, or not be invited at all. So, you know, how do you deal with that problem? And, you know, critics like Jerry Saltz, who is probably one of the, you know, best known names, I heard him speak recently, and he talked about this. He said, well, you know, suddenly, you know, people don't want to make eye contact with you anymore. They take it personally. So it's not just, I think it's probably magnified here because everybody knows everybody, but I think it is a practical problem that exists, and I think that, you know, let's not take art criticism personally. It's a critique, and it has to be there.
True. But what's even more drastic is the fact that art criticism as a practice has completely disappeared from vernacular newspapers. I don't know about Bhavna or about Tamil, but in Marathi at least, at one point of time you did have several interesting and engaged critiques. You don't have that space for, you know, pitching an argument in any of the Marathi newspapers. You can have sort of profile pieces, if you will. But you can't really have straightforward criticism. But at the same time, you have an entire page in a newspaper like Bombay Times devoted to celebrity reporting, art celebrity reporting, or to paid art reviews. You know, basically regurgitating the catalogue essay of artists who really don't deserve that space. These are the two poles, but the other two poles are the way in which academic writing, or the way in which turgid jargoneering passes off for good academic writing. That's a severe crisis, I feel, and it is a crisis that touches several disciplines. And we all have, in fact, plodded through tracts which are extremely difficult to make sense of, not because they are complex, but because they really don't know, the writers really don't know how to use the language, okay, on the one hand. And on the other, you have, sort of descent from what one might call formalism into flourishism, where you have, you know, leanness, snazziness, sort of casual pronunciations of judgment, sort of very cheap verbal calisthenics, which sort of make you a very snappy and with-it writer. But at the end of the review or at the end of the piece, you don't really get anything. So I guess you have these 2, 3, or 4, axes around which the practice of art criticism or writing on art is getting distributed.
Abhay, you had at one point a different question you wanted to address. Do you remember that? Would you like to bring that?
Yeah. I was just wondering about this proposition of objectivity and So no, I was wondering about it and sort of thinking about whether one can in fact look at objectivity as existing, as a condition existing in degrees, or would that be a euphemism for disingenuity? That's the question I wanted to raise, and the sort of the complementary question would be, or the complementary proposition would be about the necessity to acknowledge the subjectivity of the writer. Because I feel that at one level, when the writer is actually putting himself out with so much of his personality, being displayed through his writing, he's also very vulnerable. Because he is also available for your gaze to be analyzed, to be dissected. And his pronouncements, his judgments, or her judgments can also be, dismissed. So I think it's it's an act of courage, I feel, and so in that sense, I don't completely agree with you, Sharmishta, when you say that a lot of the writing has smacks of personality, cultism, or sort of the personality of the writer overpowers the writing.
Well,
there's a fine line.
Yeah, I think it's a very fine line. I mean, I think I was, speaking more about, as you were saying, talking about flourishisms. I think that's what I was talking about more in terms of, you fall in love with your own language and your own use of language, and then it becomes about the use of that language rather than about the art object. And I think that's, a balance that always has to be maintained. And I certainly have to do it, and sometimes I have to be very aggressive and edit out parts that, just because they sound good doesn't mean it should be in there, because they're not lending to that final judgment that's being made. So it's about editing, I think, is what I was kind of drawing upon more. But certainly there should be a personality to the writing, in the sense that you're, in what you're projecting here is that, yeah, of course there has to be a style and a personality. I completely agree with that.
There are some people already clutching at mics. If you don't mind, I'll come to you. There are a couple of very eminent writers as well in the audience. If you don't mind, before I come to you, if they do have people like Chaitanya and Gayatri, if you do have some inputs on this, I'd very greatly appreciate it. And then we'll go to the audience. Would you like to say one? Yeah, there's a mic to your right.
I've listened to this with great interest because I'm passionately engaged with art criticism, and the question I would ask myself would be, why am I on the panel on curating tomorrow and not on the panel for criticism today? And the answer, of course, lies within what you've all been saying, because you all have more than one role, which is perhaps very much the condition of the critic today. The critic being the critic curator as now the new morphed personality. I think the position of the critic is really interesting because a huge slice of his or her power has been taken over by cultural studies. And you have Jim Elkins and Irit Rogoff talk about this in a very substantial way. In 2007, Jim Elkins organized an international conference on the crisis of art criticism. It's a global phenomenon. It's not just happening in India. Cultural studies takes away a very big chunk. Curatorial writing, which we haven't talked about today, but which actually starts to formulate a certain kind of critical state, critical theory, that also takes up a very big area. I'm interested, perhaps, I just want to make one or two observations, which are really about the historic line, and the very noble sort of historic line in Indian art criticism. And I'm thinking of perhaps two kinds of trajectories. After all, the question that all of you have raised is, where do you locate the art critic? So if we are to say that there is the independent journal, let's look at something like O.C. Ganguly's Rupam, 1910s, 1920s. Take this line up to Geeta Kapoor, and I think Geeta Kapoor is an important person here because she stays miles away from the newspaper, believes it is an inferior form of art criticism. That's the one that I belonged to. From my state of inferiority, I will give us depends. But let's consider that line, the line of the art journal, where the critic assumes a position of authority. And here perhaps you can link it up with a critic like, say, Clement Greenberg. And there is a very deliberate espousal of a critic's role over here as a historical interventionist. Clement Greenberg standing up and saying that when Jackson Pollock throws paint on the canvas, what he's actually doing is repudiating the whole of the art of Europe of the 1950s, and with American Expressionism, the art of America is born.